President Biden tried to respond to criticism of his support for Israel, represented by protesting voters in Michigan and some Super Tuesday states, with new proposals to get aid into Gaza. He also sent this message to Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, last night.
To the leadership of Israel, I say this: humanitarian assistance cannot be a secondary consideration or a bargaining chip. Protecting and saving innocent lives has to be a priority. As we look to the future, the only real solution to the situation is a two-state solution over time.
That, of course, is something that Netanyahu has not agreed to, unlike most of his predecessors for decades. And UN aid officials have already, though, criticized Mr. Biden's so-called new plan for a floating pier to deliver aid into Gaza, as well as what the White House called a new entry point for aid, since Israel has refused to open a much more efficient entry point into northern Gaza directly, nor permitted aid to be delivered to an existing port to get much more delivered and more quickly. Joining us now is NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel in Jerusalem today, and former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis. So, Admiral, let's fact-check a little bit the President's plan to build that temporary port. They're talking about massive amounts of aid, but that's not really the massive amounts of aid that could come in over land. And there is the Gaza crossing. Israel has not agreed to that. So what they're agreeing to is a crossing, that is already one of the crossings that's not working very efficiently. The inspections are not set up efficiently at all. And there's a trickle of aid getting in there, and then it has to go all the way to the north up this IDF roadway along the border. The aid is still not nearly enough for the crisis there.
Yeah, the number we ought to hold in our heads is 500 truckloads a day. That would cover the population pretty well. We've never hit that point. It's been kind of 200, 300 trucks a day at max. I would say that every bit helps. So, yes, pressure the Israelis to open up more land crossings, use an existing port, although it's very shallow and difficult to get in and out of. And so, and I can tell you this as an admiral, if you build that, and it can be done fairly quickly, a longer range pier, you can bring in somewhat deeper draft ships. Every one of those containers, like you see in container ships at sea, every one of those is the equivalent of hundreds and hundreds of trucks. And a good-sized container ship can bring thousands of those containers. So we ought to pursue all of these options to try and alleviate the stress on this population, which is tragic.
And I should point out, in the context of all of this, there was a large protest here in D.C. outside the White House last night. There were no arrests, no problems, but it was quite a big protest as the president was driving up, and also around the Capitol. Richard, CIA Director Bill Burns has been in the region. He's not going to Israel, we're told, contrary to some Israeli media reports, but he was in Egypt. He was, I believe, in Doha as well. But the four-party talks are not continuing. So it's at the technical level, and it is not directly engaging Hamas, which has really walked away from the talks, now still demanding, going back to their original demand for a permanent ceasefire up front.
Well, the talks have broken down. I'm speaking with a senior negotiator directly, and the Israelis are blaming Hamas, saying that they are raising the stakes. Hamas is blaming the Israelis. But basically, they have fundamentally different views of what is supposed to happen here. Hamas is still holding hostages. 200 or so Israelis are still believed to be alive, and is using them as bargaining chips. And Israel says, hand them over, and then we can discuss what happens after that. And Israel is still talking about a long-term military presence, an occupation of sorts to go to continue in Gaza for an indefinite period of time. And that is something that Hamas rejects. And it says that it won't release hostages unless there is a more of a discussion of what the final status is, unless Israelis are going to leave, unless people who are in the south of Gaza now taking shelter are allowed to go to the north. So the talks broke down because fundamentally they are still opposed of what is supposed to happen, the legitimacy of taking the hostages, which the world has rejected, but Hamas is still insisting was a sort of a legitimate military target, and is still calling them prisoners, not hostages.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan did tell some of the American hostage families in a meeting yesterday that there was still some hope. And although they know that the talks are not taking place, Burns is still in the region talking to other people and trying to get something going. I just want to also point out, Admiral, that President Biden was caught on a hot mic last night after he gave his State of the Union address during that long walkout, 33 minutes. And listen to what he said. He said, let me see if I can read it here because I'm not sure that you can all see it. He said, I told Bibi, and don't repeat this, but you and I are going to come to Jesus meeting. And then he said, I'm on a hot mic here. Good. That's good. You know, acknowledging he was talking to Senator Bennett. The come to Jesus moment is right now going to be over Rafah because he and Benny Gantz, who they think is, you know, the possible successor to him politically, is a former general, and he also believes they've got to get those last 4 battalions out of Rafah. And the U.S. says that they still don't have a plan, as Richard was just alluding to get people moved out of that area, south to north, safely, and relocated.
Yeah, leaving aside the questionability of having a come to Jesus meeting, given the religious differences between Christians and Jews, let's park that. But the real point here is taking it as the apocryphal expression it is. He means he's going to speak very sharply and I think begin to really use some of the leverage that the United States has in terms of weapons being delivered to Israel, which has been thus far a blank check. So the president has some cards to play when he has that conversation with Bibi. I suspect what'll happen is that the conversation will slow the Israeli move toward a massive, overwhelming, air-driven campaign over Rafah. I think that's unacceptable and really would hurt Israel more than it would help Israel. But a land campaign that uses special forces in the lead is relatively tight going into Rafah. That's probably still going to happen in some way. Final thought. The key here, and you mentioned it already, Andrea, is creating safe passage out of Rafah for this over 1 million civilians that are crowded into it. All the more reason to get aid flowing north. That'll pull the Gazans to the north, open up the field for the Israelis. Look, it's not going to happen in the next 48 hours. This is something that's going to build. There'll be time for these conversations between the president and the prime minister.
Richard Engel, Admiral James Stavridis, thanks to both of you.